welcome to the Daily Space. My name is Annie Wilson, and most weekdays, the CosmoQuest team is here putting science into your brain. Today, however, is for Rocket Roundup. Let's get to it, shall we? First up, on April 7th at 1734 UTC, SpaceX launched a Falcon 9 from Slick 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida. Booster 1058 took, you guessed it, another 60 Starlink satellites to orbit for the Starlink 23 mission. This marks 1,383 Starlink version 1.0 satellites launched. So there's just 57 satellites or one launch until the first phase of the Starlink constellation is complete. Let's take a look at the launch.
Stage 1's startup pressures.
T-minus 15 seconds.
Falcon 9 is configured for flight.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition and liftoff.
Pitching downrange.
The last several launches had successful landings. Unfortunately, the video feed on the ship often cuts out, which means no live video of those landings. This time, however, viewers were treated to video from both the drone ship and the booster throughout the entire landing process. The camera feed on their drone ship was briefly interrupted by the usual rocket plume interference, which resulted in an odd side-by-side image showing the booster on one side of the screen, while the other side was just an empty barge because the video feed was lagging. Let's take a look at that.
So burn will last about 30 seconds. You can see it coming down towards the Atlantic Ocean there. What a beautiful view from that stage 1 camera.
Stage 1 landing leg deploy.
What an amazing view.
For those of you keeping score at home, this was the 7th mission for this particular booster, and both of the fairing halves were reused. One fairing half was on its 4th flight, while the other was on its 2nd flight. Booster 1058 successfully landed on the drone ship, Of Course I Still Love You. This time, however, only one fairing half was recovered by SpaceX's new recovery ship, the Sheila Bordelon. This was the 17th fairing half SpaceX has successfully recovered. As of press time, both Go Ms. Chief and Go Ms. Tree have had their fairing catcher nets removed and are headed back to their owners in Louisiana. Together, they have successfully caught 9 fairing halves out of a total 18 catch attempts. Next up, on April 8th at 23:01 UTC, a Chinese Long March 4 Bravo successfully launched the Shiyan 603 satellite into orbit from the Haiyuan Satellite Launch Center in northern China. Several days before the launch, a sandstorm caused a delay in assembling and testing the rocket, but on launch day, the weather was favorable with clear skies. Roll that launch footage. According to the builders of the satellite, the China Academy of Sciences, the satellite will be used for space environment detection and related technology experiments. It was launched into a 1,000-kilometer orbit inclined at 99.5 degrees. According to Gunter Krebs, who keeps detailed notes on various spaceflight info for his website, Gunter's Space Page, this is a higher orbit than the previous 2 Shiyan 6 satellites that were launched in 2018 and 2020, respectively. China's National Center for Nanoscience and Technology also announced that one of the demonstrations aboard the Xi'an satellite is a new nano-composite ultra-black coating that can absorb up to 99.6% of light in the ultraviolet to near infrared spectrum. And the image on the screen, the image on the right is coated with that nano-composite ultra-black stuff. And the one on the left is just usual aerospace blackening treatment. So you can see how different these things are. Anyways, based on this source, our research team believes that Xi'an 603 is testing imaging reconnaissance technology with stealth features. The US was rumored to operate a satellite somewhat like this called MISTY. MISTY was launched in 1990 on STS-36 and spent at least 7 years in orbit, but it hasn't been seen by observers since 1997. This launch marked the 365th launch of a Long March series rocket and the 41st launch of a Long March 4 Bravo. After the break, we'll be back to discuss a parking jam at the ISS. Yes, folks, someone had to be asked, can you please move your capsule? Stay tuned. For our last launch of the week, on April 9th at 7:42 UTC, a Soyuz 2.1 Alpha launched with the Soyuz MS-18 spacecraft carrying 2 Russian cosmonauts and 1 NASA astronaut to the International Space Station. Let's watch the launch. Both the spacecraft and the rocket are named Soyuz, as you may have noticed, which means union in Russian. Why in the world did they name the rocket and the craft the same thing? Turns out it was a Soviet tradition to name the rocket after the very first payload it carried into orbit. So the first payload of this version of the R7, for the rocket nerds out there, that's the standard core and boosters with a new Block 1 upper stage. Anyways, this version of the R7, its first payload that it carried to orbit in 1966 was a Soyuz. So that's why they called the rocket Soyuz. You can also see this with the Proton rocket after it launched the astrophysics satellite of the same name. This is up there with don't let astronomers name anything. So this marked the 1,937th launch of an R7-derived Soyuz rocket. JAXA astronaut Soichi Noguchi took a picture of the rocket's contrail as it ascended, which he posted to his Twitter account. The spacecraft was successfully placed into orbit on the new 3-hour rendezvous trajectory, arriving at the station's Rossovit module at 11:05 UTC. Soyuz MS-18 is only the second crewed Soyuz to use this trajectory, with Soyuz MS-17 being the first back in October 2020. It was demonstrated on several uncrewed Progress spacecraft first, in the Russian philosophy of incremental testing. The 3-hour rendezvous requires exceptional orbital insertion accuracy from the launcher, and the ISS has to be in a very specific spot. Roscosmos goes to all of this trouble because the Soyuz is a very cramped spacecraft, and the agency prefers the crew to spend as little time as possible in the confined space. Back in the 1970s, the standard rendezvous time to the Salyut stations took 2 days or more. So after 2 hours of leak checks, Mark Vande Hei, Oleg Nowitzki, and Pyotr Dibrov entered the ISS and joined Expedition 64, temporarily increasing the number of crew members on the ISS to 10. This is Vande Hei's second spaceflight, Nowitzki's third, and Dubrov's first. The trio will spend the standard 6 months in orbit before returning. Notably, Dubrov and Nowitzki will perform a series of spacewalks to integrate the Nauka module to the ISS when it finally docks to the space station later this year. Soyuz MS-18 was originally slated to fly with 3 Russian crew members for the arrival of Nauka, which is the next Russian module for the space station. At the last minute on March 9th, American astronaut Vande Hei was added to assure the backup capability in the event of a problem with any crew spacecraft or an emergency aboard the space station that requires a crew to return to Earth sooner than planned, end quote. Vande Hei's seat was procured under unusual circumstances. When I talk about a seat, I don't mean the physical seat that the astronauts ride in. A seat is just shorthand way of saying a ride to and from the space station. Axiom Space had bought a seat on a Soyuz from Roscosmos with the intention of sending one of their engineers up to their future module. That module will be attached to the International Space Station sometime between now and 2024. But because Vande Hei was needed on the station and the Axiom space module isn't in space yet, NASA proposed a trade. This seat on this Soyuz in exchange for a seat on a future Crew Dragon or Starliner mission. Soyuz MS-17 will return to Earth on April 17th. SpaceX's Crew 2 will launch in late April while Crew 1 is still at the station. This will increase the station's population from 7 to 11. Crew 1 will return to Earth once Crew 2 has arrived and settled in. Speaking of Crew 1, on April 5th at 1100 hours, astronauts Hopkins, Glover, Walker, and Noguchi of the Crew 1 Dragon Resilience climbed back into their spacecraft and undocked. But they weren't coming back to Earth. Not just yet, anyways. Commander Michael Hopkins flew the spacecraft around 90 degrees from International Docking Adapter 2 to International Docking Adapter 3. IDA 3's port is on the zenith or space-facing side of Node 2 on the ISS. In the reference frame of the ISS, Node 2 is at the very front of the space station. The reason for this move was to free up the IDA 2 port on the forward side of Node 2 for the upcoming Crew 2 spacecraft. The Crew 2 spacecraft is only programmed to dock at this very specific port, the IDA 2, so the Crew 1 spacecraft needed to just move. All 4 astronauts suited up and boarded the spacecraft for the relocation in case of an emergency, which would prevent it from being able to dock again. It's standard practice for all crewed spacecraft relocations to suit up and be prepared to return to Earth in case something goes wrong when changing parking spaces. Fortunately, they had no problems, and after 45 minutes of free flight, Dragon Resilience docked to IDA 3. Another reason for the move is the upcoming Commercial Resupply Mission 22. This cargo Dragon will be bringing up a pair of new solar panels for the space station, and the Canada arm can't reach into the Dragon's trunk if it's docked at IDA 2, so it will dock at IDA 3 after the Crew 1 leaves. According to Scott Manley, this was only the third time a crewed spacecraft had docked to the pressurized mating adapter 3, which is what IDA-3 is attached to. The others were Endeavour on STS-97 and Atlantis on STS-98 in 2000 and 2001, respectively. We'll be back with space history after this quick break. This Monday marked a special milestone in spaceflight history. 60 years ago, on April 12, 1961, at 6:07 UTC, Vostok 1 launched from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in what was then the Soviet Union. Aboard Vostok 1 was cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin, the first human to travel into outer space. The mission consisted of a single orbit around the Earth, lasting 108 minutes from launch to landing, and skimming the upper atmosphere at 169 kilometers at its lowest point. Preparations for the historic flight began the day before with the Vostok K rocket and the attached Vostok 3KA space capsule transported in a horizontal position to the launch pad. Technicians conducted a quick examination of the boosters, and once everything looked good to go, Gagarin and backup cosmonaut German Titov were given a final review of the flight plan. It was decided that the launch would occur at 9:07 in the morning, Moscow time, the following day. The specific time was chosen so the solar illumination would be ideal for the orientation system sensors as the capsule started to fly over Africa, which was when the retro rockets would need to fire for reentry. Prior to the flight, Gagarin was examined by a team of doctors. One of the doctors, Ada Katovskaya, recalled that Gagarin looked more pale than usual. He was unsociable and quiet, which was not like him at all. He would answer by nodding or a short yes to all questions. Sometimes he would start humming some tunes. This was a different Gagarin. We geared him up and hugged. And I said, "Yuri, everything will be fine." And he nodded back. The iconic CCCP on Gagarin's helmet was hand-painted by engineer German Lebedev on their way to the launch site. In light of a U-2 plane incident less than a year prior, Lebedev feared there was a small chance that without some country identification, Gagarin could be mistaken for a spy upon landing. The mission itself was designed to be controlled by either automatic systems or ground control, meaning that the capsule's manual controls were completely locked. This was at the recommendation of medical staff and spacecraft engineers who were unsure how a human would react to weightlessness. According to Vostok's chief designer, Oleg Ivanovsky, a code was given to the cosmonaut to unlock controls in case of an emergency. Tension was high the morning of the launch, with chief designer Sergei Korolev reportedly suffering from stress-induced chest pains, because up until this point, Soviet space launches only had a 50% success rate. How this launch was going to go was anyone's guess. Gagarin entered the Vostok 1 spacecraft around 7:10 local time, or 4:10 UTC. And after a series of tests and checks lasting about 40 minutes, the hatch was closed. Gagarin soon reported that the hatch was not sealed properly, and technicians scrambled to fix the problem. Ivanovsky personally helped to rebolt the latch. During this time, Gagarin was described as appearing calm. Sensors recorded his pulse at a low 64 beats per minute as he listened to music play over the radio. Finally, at 6:07 UTC, Vostok 1 lifted off from Baikonur Cosmodrome Site Number 1. Korolev radioed to wish Gagarin a good flight, to which Gagarin replied, "Let's go." The 4 strap-on boosters, the rocket's core stage, and the final rocket stage all performed successfully. As the rocket passed over central Russia, Gagarin radioed in, "Everything is working very well. All systems are working. Let's keep going." And at 6:17 UTC, the rocket's final stage shut down, and Vostok 1, carrying the first human into space, reached orbit. 10 seconds later, the rocket separated from the capsule. After a little over 1 hour in orbit, Vostok's automatic systems brought it to the required attitude for retro rocket firing over the west coast of Africa, approximately 8,000 kilometers uprange of the landing point. When the command was sent to separate the Vostok service module from the reentry module, the equipment module remained attached by a bundle of wires, which caused strong gyrations that shook the spacecraft. The wires eventually broke, causing the modules to finally separate, which stabilized the spacecraft. Gagarin ejected from the craft while it was still at an altitude of 7 kilometers, his parachute deploying almost immediately. 10 minutes later, he was safely on the ground, 41 kilometers from Engels in the Saratov region. A young girl named Rita Nirskanova and her grandfather witnessed Gagarin's descent. He later recalled his encounter with them, saying, "When they saw me in my spacesuit and the parachute dragging alongside as I walked, they started to back away in fear. I told them, 'Don't be afraid. I am a Soviet citizen like you who has descended from space, and I must find a telephone to call Moscow.'" After this break, we'll be back with the stats and this week's space fact. Stay tuned. To wrap things up, here's a running tally of a few spaceflight statistics for the current year. There are currently 6 toilets in space, 3 installed on the International Space Station, 1 on the Crew Dragon, and 1 on each Soyuz. There have been 30 total orbital launch attempts so far this year, including 1 failure. 751 satellites have gone into space from those launches. I keep track of orbital launches by where they launched from, also known as spaceport. Here's that breakdown. USA 12, China 9, Kazakhstan 4, New Zealand 2, Russia 2, India 1. Your random space fact for the week is that Ingenuity, the space helicopter, carried a small piece of aviation history with it to Mars. Taped to a cable below its solar panel is a postage stamp-sized piece of muslin fabric from the very first plane to make a successful, powered, heavier-than-air flight, the Wright brothers' 1903 Flyer. 2 other fragments of the 1903 Flyer went to space. Neil Armstrong carried a piece on the Apollo 11, and John Glenn took a different piece with him on the STS-95. Ingenuity will make its flight soon, and we'll have coverage of that here on CosmoQuest after it occurs. This has been the Daily Space. Pamela and Beth will be back tomorrow, bringing you more science.